Imagine a small, rain-swept island on the edge of Europe. This island, Britain, seemed an unlikely place to build a global empire. Yet from this very spot, a story of ambition, conflict, and extraordinary change would unfold. It would touch every corner of the planet, at its height covering a quarter of the world's land. The British Empire produced incredible triumphs and heartbreaking tragedies. Heroes, villains, grand ideas, and terrible injustices. But our story begins not with conquest, but with a desperate struggle for survival against a terrifying enemy from the sea. In the 9th century, England was not one country. It was a patchwork of kingdoms. Small realms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria existed side by side. Then the Vikings arrived in longships, burning, looting, striking fear. One man stood against the tide, Alfred, King of Wessex, forced into the marshes of Somerset. Legend says he hid in a hut, then rallied loyal followers and reformed army and navy. After victory at Edington, he forced Guthrum's baptism and established fortified towns, the burhs. He promoted learning, set defenses, and laid foundations for a unified England. This was the birth of England. We now move to the Norman conquests and the pushing outwards of England's borders. The spirit of conquest that defeated the Vikings soon turned outward under Norman rule. The Normans were master castle builders and formidable warriors. Their gaze fell on Wales, mountainous, proud, fiercely independent. Welsh princes used terrain and guerrilla tactics against heavier English forces. Norman marcher lords pushed west, building rings of castles to dominate the landscape. Imposing keeps like Chepstow, Caerphilly, Conwy became symbols of English power. Welsh princes like Llywelyn ap Gruffydd fought bravely but were eventually overwhelmed. Edward I's late 13th century campaign finished the conquest, crowned by a ring of castles and a Prince of Wales. Across the Irish Sea, 1169 saw Norman knights land in Wexford, invited, then turned invaders. Strongbow seized Dublin. Henry II arrived to assert authority. England declared itself Lord of Ireland. What began as feudal footholds became 8 centuries of English involvement, imprinting law, religion, and conflict. Yet Welsh culture and language endured, surviving the long shadow of conquest. With Britain more unified, attention turned to the continent, and to France. The stage was set for centuries of continental rivalry. But first, England would be drawn into a long war with France, a war that would sap wealth and reshape the nation. Next, the 100 Years of War. England's kings still held lands in France, provoking a lasting rivalry. In 1337, this rivalry ignited into what we call the 100 Years' War. The English longbow proved devastating. At Crécy and Agincourt, armies that looked invincible were felled by storms of arrows. Heroes like the Black Prince and Henry V were forged in those fields. Their deeds were immortalized, shaping English identity. Then came Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who turned the tide for France. Her capture and martyrdom emboldened French resistance. By the war's end, England had lost most of its French holdings. The cost in blood and treasure left the realm exhausted and divided. Disgruntled nobles returned home, sparking the Wars of the Roses. This civil war ended medieval England and birthed the Tudor Age. With the French dream faded, England turned outward, toward the oceans. A changing world, printing, science, and better ships made exploration possible. Columbus's voyage in 1492 shattered the old maps and triggered a European scramble. England, once late to the race, now planted its first flags in North America. Next, the age of discovery and Tudor transformation. As the 15th century closed, the world was changing faster than ever. New tools, astrolabes, compasses, better ships, made long voyages possible. In 1497, John Cabot sailed from Bristol seeking a route to Asia. He probably landed in Newfoundland and claimed the land for England. No gold but a legal claim, a footprint that would seed future empire. Exploration was driven by gold, spices, national glory, religion, and curiosity. Back home, Henry VIII's break with Rome recreated England as a distinct Protestant nation. Seizing monastic wealth strengthened the crown and created a new loyal gentry. A violent swing under Mary I tried to restore Catholicism, earning her a fearsome name. Elizabeth I established a moderate Protestant settlement stabilizing the nation. Elizabeth encouraged privateers, sea dogs like Hawkins and Drake, to challenge Spain. But ambition had a brutal side. Hawkins's voyages marked the English entry into the slave trade. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, raided Spanish ports, and returned laden with treasure. His voyage paid off debts and signaled England's rising maritime power. Early attempts at permanent colonies failed. Roanoke vanished and became a mystery. Tensions with Spain grew to open war and culminated in the Armada. Next, the Armada and the birth of naval England. Under Elizabeth I, England, a David against Spain's Goliath, confronted the greatest empire in the world. Spain's American silver flowed back to Europe, funding vast fleets and armadas. Drake raided ports and ships, enriching investors and weakening Spain. Raleigh promoted colonization, naming lands Virginia, even as Roanoke failed. Philip II vowed to crush Protestant England and assembled the greatest fleet seen in Europe. England awaited invasion, the fate of the realm hung in the balance. English tactics and fireships disrupted the Armada's formation. A ferocious storm, the Protestant wind, finished the Armada's chance. Victory was hailed as divine favor and confirmed England's naval future. It secured survival and announced England as a rising maritime power. Emboldened, England turned from raiding to settlement, chartered companies and private ventures alike. Ships left for Jamestown, Plymouth, and the Caribbean, seeds of empire planted. But ambition carried moral costs. Early English involvement in the slave trade stained expansion, and not every venture succeeded. The lost colony remained an eerie warning. Next, permanent settlements and the plantation economies that followed. Jamestown and Plymouth would shape very different colonial futures, onward to settlements and sugar. In 1607, investors from the Virginia Company founded Jamestown, England's first permanent colony. The early years were brutal. Disease, hunger, conflict with the Powhatan. Tobacco saved Jamestown, a new cash crop that reshaped colonial life and labor. Exports created a transatlantic boom and drew more settlers. In 1620, the Mayflower carried pilgrims seeking religious freedom, a different colonial motive. Survivors built a new settlement. Their society emphasized faith and community. England also seized Caribbean islands, Barbados, St. Kitts, for sugar cultivation. Sugar was immensely profitable and brutally labor-intensive. Colonies varied: royal colonies, proprietary grants, company charters, a patchwork of governance. This diversity created a dynamic but often chaotic imperial world. From tobacco fields to sugar islands, wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. But that wealth was built on the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. Goods left Liverpool and Bristol for West Africa, slaves were shipped to the Americas, and goods returned to Britain. The Middle Passage was a voyage of disease, brutality, and death for millions. At home, wealth fueled industrialization and civic progress. But the empire's prosperity was entangled with chains, a contradiction at its heart. Next, trade in the East and the rise of the East India Company. While building empire in the West, England's gaze also moved east to India. India was a land of ancient civilizations and fabulous wealth, spices, textiles, courts of splendor. In 1600, the East India Company received a royal charter, launching trade on an unprecedented scale. Trading posts, called factories, appeared in ports like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. They traded wool and silver for cotton, silk, and spices, a profitable exchange. For a century it was trade, merchants, ledgers, and profit. Envoys like Sir Thomas Roe cultivated royal favor. The company grew influenced by diplomacy. But in the 18th century, as the Mughal state weakened, the company turned from trade to territorial power. Led by figures like Robert Clive, company forces won decisive battles, most famously Plassey in 1757. Control of Bengal gave the company revenue and the means to govern large territories. Meanwhile, the Atlantic plantation economies continued to rely on enslaved labor, a global system of exploitation. Ports like Bristol and Liverpool profited. Ledger entries hid human tragedies. Chattel slavery stripped millions of freedom, tore families apart, and left scars that persist. The riches fueling empire came at a catastrophic human cost. By the late 18th century, the company was not just trading, it administered, taxed, and ruled. The empire's reach now spanned continents, its zenith awaited. Next, the great 19th century empire. By the 19th century, the British Empire had reached its zenith. Vast, global, seemingly unassailable. Industrial power, steam engines, and railways gave Britain unprecedented advantage. Dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand became settler colonies and dominions. India remained the empire's greatest prize, ruled directly after the 1857 uprising. The late 19th century scramble for Africa added vast territories to the imperial map. Strategic outposts, Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, secured global trade and navy routes. The empire was held by military force, economic interests, and an ideology of civilizing duty. Missionaries, schools, railways, and courts spread British institutions, often reshaping local societies. But seeds of decline were present: nationalist ideas, rising local elites, and high costs of rule. Political movements grew, in India and across Africa, demanding rights and representation. 2 world wars drained Britain. Men and treasure poured into global conflict. Post-war, Britain emerged exhausted and economically weakened. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 signaled the empire's decisive unraveling. One by one, colonies gained independence, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. The empire left tangled legacies: language, law, trade, and lingering conflicts. Today, remembrance, debate, and reckoning continue. Finally, the complicated legacy. From Alfred's marshes to an empire upon which the sun never set, the story is vast and contradictory. It produced innovation, law, and institutions, and also exploitation, dispossession, and suffering. English language, legal systems, and trade links still shape the modern world. But post-colonial nations continue to question, contest, and revise that legacy. Museums, memorials, and public debates struggle with truth, celebrating achievements while confronting harms. Calls for reparative justice, truth, and reconciliation grow louder. The empire accelerated industrial progress, global institutions, and cross-cultural exchange. But it also inflicted slavery, dispossession, and long-term inequalities across continents. Ultimately, this is a human history, millions of personal stories of endurance and loss. Understanding that history requires listening, learning, and honest conversation. Former imperial ties persist, reworked into trade, diplomacy, and cultural connections. Across former colonies, people reclaim culture, language, and identity on their own terms. The British Empire changed the world irrevocably, for good and for ill. Remembering it honestly is the first step toward a fairer, shared future. This has been an epic timeline, complex, painful, and profound. For sources and further reading, see the description. Subscribe for more history documentaries.